With Labor Day behind us, the election is now just 60 days out, and now polls are going to have a bit more weight than they used to as the campaign is really getting into full swing and more people are going to be paying attention to the general election. So obviously we have to ask the big question, which is whether or not these polls are going to underestimate Donald Trump's support or not, because in 2020 and 2016, Donald Trump was massively underestimated in several key battleground states that ultimately won him the election. And in 2016, the polls completely missed Trump's surprise victory. So we're going to talk about whether or not the polls in 2024 will underestimate Trump's support and what factors would lead to that being the case. So we're going to get to all of that and more in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So currently, Donald Trump is down 2 points nationally. Now, these polls really don't mean a whole lot because ultimately the national popular vote obviously doesn't decide the election. But when we look at some of the key battleground states around the country, Donald Trump is neck and neck with Kamala Harris. Georgia, Kamala Harris is up by 0.1. In Michigan, Kamala is up by 1. In Nevada, Harris is up by just 0.6. And in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, all of these states are really a statistical tie. So this election is really going to come down to the wire. And so far, polling in places like Georgia, for example, has been pretty spot on. In 2022 and 2020, the RCP average was almost identical to the actual margin of the election. So if Harris is up by 0.1, you could bet she might win the state by a couple of points. But we still have 2 whole months to go before the election. Now, at this point in time in 2020, Joe Biden was up by 7 points and Hillary Clinton was up by 4. So if you take those 2 points into account, Trump is in his best position yet, according to the polls. Now, this is a stark contrast to where the polls were just a month or two ago when Joe Biden was still in the race, because if we go back to the end of July 20th, Trump was up by 3 points in the RCP average, and he was leading in a number of battleground states by much wider margins. But then, of course, when the Democrats put Kamala Harris as the nominee, Trump's lead massively eroded to the point where now Kamala Harris is up by 2 points. Now, I think the main reason for this erosion is that Democrats now have more enthusiasm than they did when Biden was the nominee, because I think the polls painted a really grim picture for Democrats when Biden was still on the ticket, because Biden's popularity was at an all-time low. In most states across the country, barring the most liberal, he was unpopular, and Democratic enthusiasm was very low. If we take a look at these polls from back in April of 2024, only 36% of Democrats were very or somewhat enthusiastic about the 2024 election, compared to 63% of Republicans. Now, that number had been down from December, where Republicans were at 47%, Democrats were at 21%. Now, I think part of the reason this number is so low is just because the election was a year out, so most people weren't really paying attention. But as of April, Republicans still held the lead for the enthusiasm gap. If we take a look at recent Gallup numbers, Democrats now hold the lead for voter enthusiasm. Compared to previous elections, are you more enthusiastic than usual about voting or less enthusiastic? And Democrats that chose more enthusiastic was 78%, Republicans 64%, and all U.S. adults, so basically the average of both of these together, was 69%. Now, back in March, that number was just 55 for Democrats, 59 for Republicans. So Republicans had a 4-point lead there. Now they're at a 14-point deficit. So I think mainly this is because Democrats have a younger, more energetic nominee than what we've had previously. And if we take a look at enthusiasm in election years, back in 2016, the enthusiasm in November among all adults compared to previous elections was just 47%. So 2016 was almost an all-time low in recent elections, and now people seem very energized and motivated to vote. So this could be a critical factor as to whether or not the polls are going to be accurate about the election result, because if Democrats are more enthusiastic, I think that's going to be reflected in the polls. But also you have to account for the fact that notoriously polling has had a bias against Republicans, because typically Republicans have been underpolled, especially in the Midwest, places like Wisconsin, Michigan, partly because of political geography, but also I think Trump voters are less likely to respond to polls. Now, I've heard the methodology has changed a number of times, and 2022, I think, was the last big polling miss that we had. So 2024 is going to be the real test to see if this methodology change actually works, because I've heard from some people that now, instead of discounting Trump supporters for hanging up or something like that and not answering the poll. They're counting them as Trump voters, and before that wasn't the case. So it painted a much different picture back in 2016, which had Hillary Clinton up by several points in battleground Rust Belt states she would end up losing. I mean, this was the state of the race right before the election, and it painted a pretty narrow picture. Hillary Clinton was up 272, Trump was at 266. So this was more of a conservative estimate than a lot of other media groups, a lot of bigger media companies. FiveThirtyEight, for example, had Hillary Clinton at a 71% chance to win on election day. And if we take a look at some of the latest polls, places like Florida, for example, were put in the Trump positive column. Iowa was put in the Trump positive column, which had voted for Obama back in 2012, 2008. North Carolina, unsurprisingly. Nevada, interestingly enough, was actually put in the Trump column because I'm pretty sure Trump was leading in Nevada on election day in 2016. But interestingly enough, polling really missed Wisconsin, for example, which Trump actually won by less than a point, and put it in the same category as Oregon, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. So that goes to show you the state of how bad the polls were in some of these battlegrounds. I mean, Pennsylvania being in the Clinton lean category, I think is pretty fair. Michigan as well, polls narrowed up there as well. But if we take a look at the polls this time around, all of the polls are basically well within the margin of error. And in all cases, Trump or Harris is up by a point or less than. I mean, there's really no other state where you have a commanding lead by any of the candidates. And that's a huge switch from what we saw when Biden was still the nominee. Because when Joe Biden was the nominee, we had Trump up with massive leads in places like Arizona, in Nevada, Wisconsin, and all of these states we're going to talk about in depth more as we get closer to the election, because I think all of them deserve their own separate breakdown. But as for the polls this time around, for this election, I really think it's all going to come down to suburban turnout, because if suburban turnout is very high in these left trending suburbs, I think Harris is the favorite. And, you know, the polls are sort of reflecting this shift away from Donald Trump, because I think there were a lot of voters who were uneasy about voting for somebody like Joe Biden because of his age, his lack of competence at that age, you know, and obviously the big health concerns that are raising alarm bells about for years. But Harris is somebody who is just, in the eyes of average Americans, just some Democrat. You know, she's a liberal woman, but at the end of the day, they still think she can run the country and keep Americans safe. And that's ultimately why you have the polls as they are, because Kamala Harris isn't Joe Biden. She doesn't have the massive burden of being older. And now Trump is the old candidate in the race, not Biden. So that whole attack is basically out the window, because now Harris can attack Trump for being too old to be president. And, you know, whether you agree with that attack or not, it's irrelevant. It's going to have an impact in the election. So, you know, taking a look at the states that are really going to decide this race, it's down to just 7. Surprisingly enough, North Carolina is only going to Donald Trump, according to RCP, by less than a point. So you have a very, very close margin in every single state right now. But if I had to guess, based on the partisan lean of some of these states, Michigan probably narrowly leaning for Kamala. Obviously, North Carolina narrowly leaning for Trump. And really, all the other states are pure toss-ups. Nevada I would have put in the Trump column, but now Kamala Harris is the favorite. And typically, polls in Nevada actually undersample Democrats. So if that's any indication, Kamala Harris also has the advantage in Nevada. So that's really the state of the race right now. Wisconsin, I think the polls are up for Harris now, but this is a state that typically undersamples Republicans. Georgia, the polls are spot on, so Trump has the narrowest of disadvantages there. Harris is up by 0.1. And Pennsylvania, this is actually a state where Kamala Harris is struggling for some reason, especially among white men. And that's something that doomed Hillary Clinton there back in 2016. And I think that the polls are accurate with her erosion among white men. You could potentially see a surprise there, because Donald Trump is essentially targeting all of his efforts in Pennsylvania and Georgia for the most part when it comes to the ad game and resources, because really these states are going to decide the election. Because if Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania and Georgia, he wins the election. That's 270. As long as he holds on to North Carolina, he can lose Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan and still be elected to a second term. So that's why there's been such a razor focus on these two states. They're the two biggest electoral prizes, and they're pure toss-ups. Now, Nate Silver's not somebody who typically has the best track record when it comes to predicting elections, but supposedly he's been noticing a drop in support among white men in Pennsylvania and Michigan, and it's becoming a pretty big issue for Kamala Harris, as I mentioned a bit earlier, because he has this model that crunches the numbers in some ways and talks about who's likely to win the popular vote. That's Harris, 59% chance she wins that. Trump wins the popular vote, 40% chance. so on and so forth. So obviously the odds of a big electoral landslide in the election are very low. Any of the candidates winning a majority of the vote, 50%, is under 50%, and I think that's still because you have a significant third-party presence. Even with RFK out of the race, I think you might see more third-party voting this time around than last time. But of course, I think what's fresh in a lot of people's minds is the 2022 midterms and how those polls drastically missed Democratic enthusiasm. So I think that would be a warning for Republicans, because as of right now, Democrats have the enthusiasm advantage. They're more energized than ever. And it's also because abortion's on the ballot, because back in 2022, before Roe v. Wade was overturned, Republicans were expected to have a pretty big victory in the Senate and the House. And, Dobbs really changed everything, because now Democrats were the ones being undersampled because they were much more enthusiastic. So sort of a cautionary tale for Republicans that if Democrats continue to hold the enthusiasm gap, they're probably going to win the election. I think that's ultimately what's going to decide whether or not the polls swing left or swing right as compared to the actual result. It's going to be the enthusiasm gap. Either there's still a shy Trump voter effect or there's not. And I think, after 2022, I think it's more likely that there's not, but there still is the chance that Trump is being underestimated in some of these states. And obviously the polls are probably going to fluctuate before we get to the election. So you could very well see Trump take the lead in Georgia again, Michigan, Nevada, and things kind of switch back and forth. So the polls as they stand today have Kamala Harris as the favorite. But again, with this popular vote margin of just 1.8, she would probably lose the election, because ultimately it typically takes Democrats a 3 to 4 point lead in the popular vote in order to win the Electoral College. So about 2 points is not going to be enough. And if you look at places like Pennsylvania, for example, and Michigan, Wisconsin, all states that have tended to have a undersampling of Republicans in polls, Donald Trump is well within the margin of error in all these states, and he's underwater by less than a point. So if the polls were to have a 2016, 2020-like swing, Donald Trump would win all of these states, and he would ultimately win the election. So obviously, we still have to wait and see. I think that's most of the case in politics, especially as we get closer to the election. It's really going to depend on what data we end up getting in, but I ultimately think it's going to be down to which side has more enthusiasm. And right now, polling says the Democrats have more enthusiasm because they just swapped out their nominee. They're more excited about Kamala. But of course, this could change in the coming days, which is ultimately why it's still up in the air as to whether who the polls are going to undersample or not. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please give a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.